but we have a lot to get to tonight, so we'll still get started. I'll do a quick recap. Quick recap of last week, and then we'll open up in prayer. So if you remember last week, we had 3 failures from King Saul. So we had him making sacrifices that he shouldn't have made. We had his rash vow of fasting, and we had him not following through killing King Agag. As a result of all of these sins, the kingdom was taken from him and his lineage. And we noticed that in every situation, someone else was doing the job that he should have done. In all those situations, he messed up and someone else stepped in to do the right thing, to do what the king should have been doing. And this will keep showing up. So that's just a little bit about last week, and why don't we open up in prayer. Holy Father, I thank you for this night. I thank you for this study and for your word. I pray that you be with us during this time and just give us some good, meaningful insight and reflection into your word and what you would have us get from it. In your name, Jesus, I pray. Amen. Okay, if you're not there, we're on page 45 in your book and 1 Samuel 16. Looks like everyone's pretty much on top of that. Okay, question 1. And maybe we'll rephrase it a little bit. Question 1 says, describe a time when you observed that knowledge is power. For one, are you familiar with that saying? You've heard that said before? Knowledge is power? Maybe? Yeah, okay. We could say, what does it mean? Do you think it's right? Is that correct? What would that statement mean? Knowledge can be power? Okay. Doesn't have to be power. A lot of us know a lot of useless things that are not powerful. All right, can you think of a time where something like knowledge is power?
You take it into like war. If you have a spy gives you information, it could be changing the battle.
Yeah.
That, you get the upper hand.
Know your enemy and know yourself, and you will not lose in 100 battles. The art of war. I know that's what you were thinking of, so I was just getting the quote out there for you. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And that's very powerful. You know, if they're lying, you're pretty much on the right track to it.
Mm-hmm.
So my own experience, that's very powerful.
Yeah. Well, that's a lawyer thing too, right? They say never ask a question you don't know the answer to. Right. Okay.
And when you're on a stand and testifying, the lawyer says, is it true? That is probably not true. So don't never be true. Most people want to testify off the standpoint because there's no good thing. That's a big mistake.
Yeah.
That's why we don't mind legally. Just in case we ever.
Yeah. Did you have something?
As usual, I look at the opposite.
Okay.
I don't necessarily, it obviously depends what it is. What David said was great, and the whole military thing,
Mm-hmm.
good. I think power is very negative at times, too.
Sure.
Too much power, ruin it. So I personally, I don't even really desire it in much way.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't always have, it seemed like it was going positive, but I don't look at it that way.
Okay.
Now, under certain circles, so I see the wisdom in that.
Mm-hmm. Okay. How about question 2? And maybe this will change the nuance of it. In what ways does knowing God lead to power? And maybe you find that an odd way to state that, but what do you think about that?
maybe power is not like the word like
Mm-hmm.
you're thinking is.
I think when you have faith in God, you feel powerful.
Okay. Yeah.
And you know what I mean?
It also takes certain things out of your control. So it's not everything is on you.
Mm.
So if you're following God's leading, then obviously He's going to go before you.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, maybe powerful doesn't quite have the right nuance for the word then. Because yeah, even though having faith in God, you could feel like things will turn out. It's not necessarily a personal, like, oh, I can do this, or that. Were you going to say something, Kim?
Well, power can be also actually very manipulative. You could be policing people, still be powerful in your own way.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah, I guess there's a lot of different ways you can use the word. Yeah. Yeah, we can use that a lot of different ways.
Instead of power, maybe confidence.
Yeah.
Courage, confidence.
Mm-hmm. Okay. All right, so on page 45 in your book, probably towards the bottom below the questions, this lesson contrasts David and Jonathan with King Saul. Both David and Jonathan knew and trusted God. As a result, both saw amazing victories in their lives. Saul, on the other hand, continued his march toward ruin as he tried controlling God instead of knowing God. All right, so that's a good lead into our text. 1 Samuel 16, we'll start in verse 1. And remember, from last week, the Lord has just officially said Saul will not continue as king. 16:1. The Lord said unto Samuel, How long wilt thou mourn for Saul, seeing I have rejected him from reigning over Israel? Fill thy horn with oil, and go. I will send thee to Jesse the Bethlehemite, for I have provided me a king among his sons. Samuel said, How can I go? If Saul hears of it, he will kill me. The Lord said, Take a heifer with you, and say, I am come to sacrifice to the Lord. And call Jesse to the sacrifice, and I will show thee what thou shalt do. And thou shalt anoint unto me him who I name unto thee. Samuel did that which the Lord spoke, and came to Bethlehem. The elders of the town trembled at his coming, and said, Comest thou peaceably? And he said, Peaceably, I'm come to sacrifice unto the Lord. Sanctify yourselves and come with me to the sacrifice. He sanctified Jesse and his sons and called them to the sacrifice. And it came to pass when they were come, he looked on Eliab and said, Surely this is the Lord's anointed. Surely the Lord's anointed is before him. But the Lord said unto Samuel, Look not on his countenance or on the height of his stature, because I've refused him. For the Lord seeth not as a man seeth. For man looketh on the outward appearance, but the Lord looks on the heart. Okay, so we have a few things here. Notice that even though by the end Samuel and Saul were very much at odds, and they won't actually interact until the death of Samuel, like he won't see him again, he's still mourning for the situation. He's still the man. Saul is still the man that Samuel anointed. Even though he didn't really want to, he still stuck by him as long as he could and had a personal relationship with him. So now that Saul is rejected as being king, Samuel is very upset, and I think this speaks to the character of Samuel. And then we have the plot. So God says, all right, we need a new king. Samuel, you are still the prophet. You're going to anoint the next king. How do we do this covertly? Because the current king will not like you anointing a new king. You're going to go do a sacrifice in Bethlehem, and while you're there, we'll lay out what's going to happen. And notice in verse 4, when Samuel came, halfway through the verse, and the elders of the town trembled at his coming. Now, I don't know exactly what this is about. I get what's being said, of course. But if you remember from last week, you had Saul's army. They had no confidence in Saul, so his own troops were trembling. They were shaking in their boots, and they were like flee and were going AWOL. So Saul's troops trembled from fear. His son Jonathan he was so powerful that the Philistines trembled. And I thought, oh, that pairs up well. Saul's men are trembling, but Jonathan makes the enemy tremble. But then you throw Samuel into the mix. So I'm not sure if maybe just track this word as we keep studying through and see if it keeps cropping up.
Could they be thinking about Samuel taking care of the king? Remember he killed the king?
Oh, yeah,
Maybe that guy.
that's true. The last time, the last time we saw Samuel, he was killing the pagan king, hacking him to pieces.
Like news is delayed, you know?
Yeah. Or they just haven't seen him, so like that
Or why are you showing up here?
yeah. Well, and we don't have time to get into it, but there is a very interesting politic at play when you have Samuel, the guy who was the judge over Israel and is still a prophet, and then you have the new king that's appointed in his place, but Samuel still goes around doing things, giving advice, prophesying, making decisions. He's still heavily involved in the government. So like there's a really weird power dynamic at play. So it's very hard to understand how people view him all the time. But anyway, we'll keep an eye out for the trembling throughout. But by the end of that, he was looking at Eliab, a son of Jesse. And he said, yeah, surely this guy's got to be king. But question 4 in your book on page 46, based on what we read, what did Samuel see in Eliab that made him think he would be the next king?
He's tall. Like he was looking out his outlook.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, another tall, strapping gentleman. Yeah. Saul was the same way. He looked kingly. Head and shoulders above everyone. He was good-looking guy, masculine, clearly like a born warrior. But that's not who God was choosing. Okay, so let's look at, still in chapter 16, go down to verse 10. Again, Jesse made 7 of his sons to pass before Samuel. And Samuel said unto Jesse, the Lord has not chosen any of these. Samuel said unto Jesse, are here all thy children? And he said, there remains yet the youngest, and behold, he keeps the sheep. And Samuel said unto Jesse, send and fetch him, for we will not sit down till he comes hither. And he sent and brought him in, and he was ruddy and withal of a beautiful countenance and goodly to look at. And the Lord said, arise, anoint him, for this is he. Then Samuel took the horn of oil and anointed him in the midst of his brethren. And the Spirit of the Lord came upon David from that day forward. So Samuel rose up and went to Ramah. Okay, so all the 7 sons of Jesse, it's not the 7th, it's not any of the 1 through 7. God chooses the 8th son, the youngest, David, who, very well-known biblical figure. This is where we first meet him. He's out keeping the sheep. It's kind of what the young kid would do, like if you're in a farming group, like in an agricultural community. It's kind of like how sometimes you have the one kid like watch the sibling. It's kind of like, well, the youngest kid, yeah, you just send him out to watch the sheep, you know. It's just kind of even though it's a very tough job, and we'll see some of that, it's kind of like send the kid out to do that. And the way he's described as being, it seems like he's attractive as well. They use the term beautiful countenance. Ruddy, it means red, so it's the exact same word that's used with Esau, if you remember him, this brother of Jacob, who, like, red, hairy guy. So I kind of get the impression that it maybe has the idea of youthfulness. So maybe like, you know, I don't know exactly how to go about it, because I don't know exactly what David would have looked like. So why you can get a lot of like a rosy red type thing. Yeah, I don't think he's just sunburned, because this is, yeah, red hair and freckles. Always think of David that way. Well, you would imagine he's a little more Middle Eastern looking, being in that area, but you don't usually have a red appearance with that. So Although the truth is, I was trying to look into it a little bit, and they say that, so Israel, as a nation, that can encompass a whole host of, like, different-looking people. You have the wife of Moses, who was African, so, like, she would have been very dark. And then you have others coming from other areas that would have been very light-skinned. So we have our general, like, Middle Eastern idea, but you're dealing with a few thousand years of a bloodline intermarrying, so, like, with other people and all sorts of stuff. So I don't know if maybe he's lighter. I don't know. He's described as kind of reddish, so maybe like a youthful type thing. Still on page 46 in your book. All right. God was Israel's warrior. He didn't need another tall, strapping man like Saul to sit on Israel's throne. God has all the power one would ever need to defeat an enemy. God needed a king who could lead Israel in their walk with him. The king's heart was to take precedent over his brawn. And as we go forward, we will find out that David is no weakling by any stretch, but that is not the primary concern with God choosing David. It's God doesn't look on the outward, he looks on the heart. So that's going to be a theme going forward. And let's pick up in verse 13. We're going to read a stretch here. We already read this, but you need to see the contrast. Then Samuel took the horn of oil and anointed David in the midst of his brethren, and the Spirit of the Lord came upon David from that day forward. So Samuel went up and went to Ramah. But the Spirit of the Lord departed from Saul, and an evil spirit from the Lord troubled him. And Saul's servant said unto him, Behold, now an evil spirit from God troubles thee. Let our Lord now command thy servants which are before thee to seek out a man who is a cunning player on a harp. And it shall come to pass, when the evil spirit from God is upon thee, that he shall play with his hand, and thou shalt be well. Saul said unto his servants, provide me now a man who can play well, and bring him to me. Then answered one of the servants and said, Behold, I've seen a son of Jesse the Bethlehemite, that is cunning in playing, and a mighty valiant man, and a man of war, and prudent in matters, and a comely person, and the Lord is with him. Wherefore Saul sent messengers unto Jesse, and said, Send me David your son, which is with the sheep. Jesse took an ass laden with bread, and a bottle of wine, and a kid, and sent them by David his son to Saul. David came to Saul and stood before him, and he loved him greatly, and he became his armor-bearer. And Saul sent to Jesse, saying, Let David, I pray thee, stand before me, for he has found favor in my sight. And it came to pass, when the evil spirit from God was upon Saul, that David took a harp and played with his hand. So Saul was refreshed and was well, and the evil spirit departed from him. All right, right out of the gate. Evil spirit from God. What are our initial thoughts on this?
I think when God removed his blessing on Saul, the Spirit, he allowed the evil spirit that he probably protected him from to torment him, I guess, in some way.
Okay. Okay.
I was thinking maybe just depression, knowing that he's no longer the chosen one,
Mm-hmm.
to lead the Israelites.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. Other thoughts?
It sounds bizarre in the way we think evil spirits,
Yeah.
People have this idol, put on the door to shoo away the evil spirits.
Mm-hmm.
And having it sent from God seems kind of bizarre.
Yeah. Yeah.
The spirit might not be evil in the sense.
Yeah. Oh, no, I'll dig into it. Yeah. Yeah.
If you're going to talk about that,
It says evil.
I know, but it's not.
Yeah. So.
Yeah.
So in the Hebrew, you have good and evil, like tree of knowledge of good and evil. It's the words tov and ra. So ra gets translated into evil. Now, I think this works in 1611 as it's translated here, but over the centuries we've altered the English a little bit, or it I guess naturally just alters. So Hebrew, something that is raw is bad, Okay, so like, you could literally translate it, the tree of the knowledge of good and bad. It just doesn't have the same ring to it. So a person, like a sinner, let's say, a sinful person is raw. They're committing raw. However, a tornado is also raw. It's bad, it's destructive. It's not, when we think of evil, we say, like, we have a category for bad and then a category for evil. Like, this fish was bad. The fish wasn't evil. We wouldn't say that if it just didn't taste good. For us, evil is like a maniacal, like, ooh, he's doing something evil. Sure, a cat could be evil. So in the Hebrew, it has a different range of meanings. So like an evil spirit, a raw spirit could be it seems to present itself as a destructive, like a depressive spirit, like you said. So the Bible's making clear Saul isn't just like, he's not just bummed out. So there's something spiritual at play, but yeah, it looks an awful lot like what we would call depression, and it will get manic more as it goes on. So there's some sort of spirit that is destructive, depressive, something that is not good for Saul, but not necessarily evil in the demonic, maniacal way that we think of it. So even, Egypt, death of the firstborn son, the angel comes by, that would be a raw spirit. Like it's a destructive spirit. It's doing God's judgment, but it is raw. It's bad. It's not bringing life and peace and blessing, that kind of thing. So, yeah, we would get into odd territory if we thought of it as a demon being sent by God to do his work. That doesn't fit with our categories. So I knew we'd spend a little bit of time there. Okay, so we read question 5. We read the description of David, sorry. How does the description of David in these verses differ from the way he's portrayed in most children's storybooks? This, of course, requires that you have like a Sunday school understanding of David that you might commonly refer to.
We've seen already, we find in the military aspects of military life.
Yeah.
And in Sunday school, he just, once in a while he played around with his sling and rock,
Yeah.
did stuff that kids did, and so that's the big difference.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, it's the big difference I see. And anyone else see a difference?
He's more like the gentle shepherd, and he's still not childish, but still a kid.
Mm-hmm.
That kind of. But evidently he's pretty good with a lot of stuff.
Yeah.
So maybe they pick up on that because he's kind of artistic, musical, that kind of
Mm-hmm.
thing. And maybe that's an odd mix.
Yeah.
It's like, kind of is. Yeah. It's like Noah's Ark, It's like the kid with Noah's Ark. It's a little bit different than what it was.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. How in Sunday school that's like a fun children's story with a rainbow and some animals on a boat. Yeah. And you get old enough to realize it's utter decimation of the planet. Yeah. Okay. So your book has a lot of questions that we're going to skip. Look at them later if you're interested. It sort of goes through what we know about David's life and some aspects from the Psalms and shows how God was using his time as a shepherd to formulate him into a person of faith. We just don't have time to go through all those questions. Go to page 48 on your book with me. All right, the paragraph, constant warfare raged between the Philistines and the Israelites during Saul's lifetime. The Philistines gathered their forces in the valley of Elah, and the Hebrews occupying one hill and the Philistines encamped on the other about 3 miles away. Into this valley strode Goliath, an immense 9-foot tall giant. His armor weighed 125 pounds and his spear weighed 20 pounds. Goliath confronted the Israelites twice a day. For 40 days he openly came to defy the armies of the living God. No one in Israel's army, including Saul, David's brother, or Jonathan, dared to challenge the giant Goliath. All right, question 9. How should the Israelites have responded to Goliath's defiance of God? No trick.
As a group, they should have all just slumbered.
Yeah, so what the textbook doesn't say that the biblical text does, they're offering a warrior match. So you got these two armies encamped on either side of this valley, and they say, okay, like we could all come and slaughter each other until the end of the day, or you send out your champion, we'll send out ours. That's a great plan until their champion's Goliath. And it's interesting that, I didn't even really think of it till studying for this. It's interesting that, I don't know if Jonathan was there or not, because he's been such a man of faith, but specifically in dealing with Philistines violently. So I don't know if he's there or not. It doesn't mention him. Yeah, he mentions that he didn't dare to challenge him.
It doesn't seem like him.
Yeah, it's an uncommon situation. Now, Saul should have been the one doing this. Like, he's the leader of Israel. Granted, in today's day and age, we wouldn't think, like, to send the president into front lines. That's not a normal approach. But back then, like, your kings went into combat. That was a very normal thing in the ancient world. So the fact that they have a champion for 40 days giving this challenge over and over, and they are just scared to do anything. All right, go to chapter 17, and we're going to skip a few verses. We're going to start in verse... Can we start in verse 26 without any... Okay. A little bit of context. As this is going on, David's brothers are at this war, or this standoff. David is sent to bring his brother some food and give the dad a report about what's going on. So he shows up in the camp. Verse 26. David spake to the men, the soldiers that stood by him, saying, "What shall be done to the man that kills this Philistine and takes away the reproach from Israel? For who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God?" The people answered him after this manner, saying, "So shall it be done to the man that killeth him." We'll get to that. And Eliab, his eldest brother, heard when David spoke unto the men. Sorry, I looked at my book to see something. And Eliab's anger was kindled against David, and he said, "Why comest thou down hither, and with whom hast thou left those few sheep in the wilderness? I know your pride and naughtiness of your heart, for thou art come down that thou might see a battle." And David said to him, "What have I now done? Is there not a cause?" And he turned from him and toward another, and spake after the same manner. And the people answered him again after the former manner. And when the words were heard which David spoke, they rehearsed them before Saul, and Saul sent for him. Yeah, we'll keep going. And David said to Saul, "Let no man's heart fail because of him, because of the giant. Thy servant, I'll go and fight with this Philistine." Saul said to David, "Thou art not able to go against this Philistine to fight with him, for thou art but a youth, and he a man of war from his youth." David said unto Saul, "Thy servant kept thy father's sheep, and there came a lion and a bear, and took a lamb out of the flock. And I went after him, and smote him, and delivered him out of his mouth. And when he arose against me, the lion, I caught him by his beard, and smote him, and slew him. Thy servant slew both the lion and the bear. This uncircumcised Philistine shall be as one of them, seeing he hath defied the armies of the living God." David said, moreover, "The Lord that delivered me out of the paw of the lion, out of the paw of the bear, will deliver me out of the hand of this Philistine." And Saul said unto David, "Go, and the Lord be with thee." So why was David so confident? God had his back quite a few times.
The moment he was anointed. That's what the scripture said.
Yeah, it's true.
Well, yeah,
Mhm.
Dave said, when you read that anointed verse,
Mm-hmm.
it was just like God.
Yeah, so the Spirit of the Lord was with him. Yeah. Yeah, so he has not only a history, like Dave was pointing out, of this lion, like Goliath doesn't seem like the problem anymore. Like, if you've, all right, so you've killed a lion and a bear in like the open field.
And save the lamb.
Yeah, he got the lamb back. Yeah, no partial victory there. So, well, different story. Different story. Yeah, so he had a past experience with God helping him in these situations, and he's been anointed, and the Lord is with him in an even more special and unique way. And yeah, Saul, after hearing this, seems okay with, you go. Like, I just tried to talk you out of it, saying, yeah, you're just a kid, but no, you go. And it's interesting that we did kind of learn that Saul already knows some of his prowess. Like, maybe he came to him to play instruments. So maybe he'd never heard the story of the lion and the bear, but he's introduced to him as, this guy is awesome at the harp, and he's also like a man of war. So cool, you know? And Saul kind of downplays that in the face of the enemy. Okay, let's go to... Oh, yeah, so this is what we didn't talk about. Page 49, just a quick little sentence. Saul, under question 13, Saul had offered a large reward for killing Goliath. Great riches, his daughter's hand in marriage, and tax exemption for life to whoever killed the giant. And that was the tax exemption was the family. Like, so that works out for his dad too. So that was the big reward if they killed the giant. All right, so verse 38. And Saul armed David with his armor, and put a helmet of brass on his head, and also armed him with a coat of mail. And David girded his sword upon his armor, and he essayed, he hesitated to go, for he had not proved the armor. David said unto Saul, I cannot go with these, for I have not proved them. And David put them off him. What is that about? I have not proved them. What is this talking about?
Tested, trained with them.
Yeah, he hasn't tested or trained with them. Do you have a note in your Bible for that? Oh, okay. I looked up a few ways you could translate that word, and yeah, it's all that idea. Yep. So what's the point of this? Like, there's a lot of material. Why is this included?
Shows his wisdom.
Okay, shows his wisdom. You think it means anything else?
Well, because he'd be encumbered by something he's never used before.
Mm-hmm.
And to slow him down or change his tactics somehow.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Compensate.
Yeah. Sure.
Well, it says they gave him Saul down.
Yeah.
Saul, instead of Saul, was a taller guy and probably
Yeah.
more than weight.
Mm-hmm.
The male, chain mail is kind of heavy.
Sure.
So David's not used to that,
Mm-hmm.
that weight, and it's probably cumbersome.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yet to me, now, like, that is all absolutely correct. Saul is much taller than him. He's older. The fact that it's in here as a detail, like, there are plenty of details that aren't in here. So I always think, if it's in there, like, why is it in here? I don't have it exactly figured out, but I think there's something symbolic about the fact that, one, he receives the king's armor. Like, that's not insignificant. But then, like, for many legitimate reasons, he refuses what the king trusts in for protection and leaves it behind. And I think there's like a symbolic thing going on here about, yes, not only is Saul taller, not only has he not tested this stuff, that's like the normal reason, I think, but I think there's something being said here about David refusing what Saul trusted in, because Saul is shown to be purely, even though David's a man of war, like we know this now, Saul seems to trust heavily in his military might, and that's been the direction of his kingship as long as he's been ruling. He trusts in himself, he trusts in his troops, and it all lets him down. And then when the armor is given to David, he casts it off and follows God. So,
He didn't have armor, he knew he was fighting the bear and stuff.
yeah, he knew what God could do with what he had already. So I think it's interesting. Okay, now we get to the action. Verse 40. David took his staff in his hand and chose him 5 smooth stones out of the brook and put them in a shepherd's bag which he had, even in a scrip, and his sling was in his hand. And he drew near to the Philistine. The Philistine came on and drew near unto David, and the man that bare his shield went before him. And when the Philistine looked about and saw David, he disdained him, for he was but a youth, and ruddy, and of a fair countenance. And the Philistine said unto David, Am I a dog, that thou comest to me with staves? And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. The Philistine said to David, Come to me, and I will give thy flesh to the fowls of the air, to the beasts of the field. Then said David to the Philistine, Thou comest to me with a sword, with a spear, with a shield, but I come to thee in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom thou defiest. This day the Lord will deliver thee into my hand. I will smite thee, and take thy head from thee, and I will give the carcass of the host of the Philistines this day unto the fowls of the air, and to the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel. And all the assembly shall know that the Lord saves not with sword or spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hands. It came to pass when the Philistine arose and came and drew nigh to meet David, that David hasted and ran toward the army to meet the Philistine. And David put his hand in his bag, took thence a stone, and slang it, and smote the Philistine in the forehead, that the stone sunk into his forehead, and he fell upon his face into the earth. So David prevailed over the Philistine with a sling and with a stone, and smote the Philistine and slew him. But there was no sword in the hand of David. Therefore David ran, stood upon the Philistine, took his sword, and drew it out of the sheath thereof, and slew him, cut off his head therewith. And when the Philistines saw their champion was dead, they fled. The men of Israel and Judah arose, shouted, and pursued the Philistines until they came to the valley, to the gates of Ekron. And the wounded of the Philistines fell down by the way to Sharam, even to Goth, and unto Ekron. Yeah, so there's the big action for the night. We're probably familiar with the story. Yes?
The head part wasn't in the Sunday school.
It was not in the Sunday school lesson. Yeah. There are some really good artistic depictions. Like there's a classic wood carving of David standing there, like holding up the Philistine's head. And it's brutal. Somehow this is a Sunday school story that we just decide to like tell to, we clean it up, we tell it to kids. And so once again, you have someone doing what the king should have done. The whole time when the people wanted a king, we need a king to go out and fight our wars for us. Here it is, and your king is hiding in his tent. David goes out, refuses the king's armor. He goes out trusting God, kills the giant, and gives a great victory to Israel. The Philistines go running back to Ekron. They go back to their own country. They go back to their own cities. So this is another huge deal. It's another failure of Saul, and it's David stepping into the role of king. It's David doing what the king should be doing. So we have that keep coming up. All right, let's look at verse... we'll go to chapter 18. Yeah. So it doesn't seem like David hangs on to it for long, but it comes up later. Goliath's sword comes up in the story when David's... It'll probably be next week, actually. So And we can discuss why that is next week, but the Goliath's stuff seems to hang around. And he does, it's worth noting, he takes Goliath's head back to the capital, like back to the palace where he's going to go and still lives in Saul's court and plays for him. He carries the giant's head, it's like 18 miles away. And he takes this trophy with him, and it seems like maybe he took a little bit more, like the sword and his armor. Yeah. All right, chapter 18, verse 1. And it came to pass when David made an end of speaking to Saul, that the soul of Jonathan, Saul's son, was knit to the soul of David, and Jonathan loved him as his own soul. And Saul took him that day, David, and would let him go home no more to his father's house. Then Jonathan and David made a covenant, because he loved him as his own soul. And Jonathan stripped himself of his robe that was upon him, and gave it to David, and his garments, even to his sword, and to his bow, and to his girdle. So, question right off the bat, why do these two get along so famously? The text doesn't really say, but I think we have some clues. Yeah, wasn't prepared for the right answer right out of the gate. Yeah, no, the text has a whole big thing on this on page 50. We'll just read part of it. Page 50, there's probably closer to the bottom, what knit Jonathan's heart with David's was not their compatible personalities or similar interests. They both had a strong trust in God that came from their close relationship with God. Their common trust in God was the strong bond between them. I'm sure they probably also just got along. That makes sense to me too. And it's also interesting that Jonathan gives him a lot of his clothing, which when you think of, all right, Jonathan is the king's son. He's a prince. But he gives to this other guy a lot of his princely stuff. Like the robe that Jonathan's wearing, it's not just like giving someone your jacket. Like he gives him the robe that the prince wears. And if you remember from last week, there weren't many swords among the Israelites because the Philistines enlisted this like gun control, sword control measure. They had taken the blacksmiths out of Israel. So the only two people that we know have swords are the King Saul and Jonathan, his son. And Jonathan gave David his sword in the text there. Like, to whatever extent Jonathan actually understands what he's doing, besides like just a close friendship thing, he's sort of giving him all the regalia of the one who will inherit the throne. Okay, so I don't know if Jonathan understands this yet, but that's what he's doing. Do you have a question?
No question. Okay. Good.
Oh, I was pointing to him. I thought it looked like you were going to say something.
I was just going to say that even though he's a prince, it almost looks like he's making a gesture that he gave up for your servant. Because of, not just physically, but because of the way they just explain it. They both feel the same with the Lord, and you know, that's a great thing. Like you said, they probably got along together anyway. But it's almost like this prince is so intelligent that, you know what, David should be the one, through God to be getting this gratitude, so to speak. And I kind of, it's like when knights used to bow down before, I give you my allegiance.
Sure.
To me, that's what it looks like.
I got you. Yeah. When it's a shame that Saul messed things up for his entire lineage, because Jonathan probably would have been a great king. From everything we know about him, Jonathan was a good, faithful man, but because of Saul's sin, God took the throne away from his line and chose David. But yeah, so either way, that's important, and it says they have a covenant, and we'll look into the technicalities of that as it comes. Okay, verse 5. I'm going to have a little run here. All right, verse 5. All right, so David went out whithersoever Saul sent him, and behaved himself wisely, and Saul set him over the men of war, and he was accepted in the sight of all the people, and also in the sight of Saul's servants. And it came to pass as they came, when David was returned from the slaughter of the Philistines, that the women came out of all the cities of Israel, singing and dancing to meet King Saul with tabrets, and that's musical instruments, with joy and with instruments of music. And the women answered one another as they played. They sang songs in the street and said, Saul has slain his thousands, and David his tens of thousands. Saul was very wroth, and the saying displeased him. And he said, They've ascribed to David 10,000s, and to me have ascribed but thousands. And what can he have more but the kingdom? And Saul eyed David from that day forward. And it came to pass on the morrow that the evil spirit from God came upon Saul, and he prophesied in the midst of the house. And David played with his hand as at other times, and there was a javelin in Saul's hand. And Saul cast the javelin, for he said, I will smite David even to the wall with it. And David avoided out of his presence twice. And Saul was afraid of David, because the Lord was with him, and was departed from Saul. Therefore Saul removed David from him, and made him his captain over 1,000, and he went out and came in before the people. And David behaved himself wisely in all his ways, and the Lord was with him. Wherefore when Saul saw that he behaved himself very wisely, he was afraid of him. But all Israel and Judah loved David, because he went out and came in before them. Any thoughts on Saul prophesying with this evil spirit? I don't have much for you here. I'm just looking to see what you guys think. Well, it says that the evil spirit returned to Saul, and it said that he prophesied in the house. So,
It doesn't say what he prophesied.
right. Could be false prophecy. Could be, I don't know. Yeah. Well, and it's interesting that he does seem to unwittingly prophesy, like, David has the love of the people. What can he have more than, my entire kingdom? Well, keep that in mind. Yeah, and you notice, so he sends him to the front lines. He sends him to be a captain over his 1,000 troops. That's how he keeps him out of the way. Maybe he'll die in the process, who knows. And if you notice the phrase, in his hand, keeps coming up, David went out with a sling in his hand. David plays the harp. He had the harp in his hand, but Saul had a javelin in his hand. They're put back to back, so you're kind of drawn to this phrase. So David's doing the beautiful work of God. Like, the sling is a sign of his faith. The harp is a sign of his skill, his praise. And while that's going on, Saul has the javelin in his hand. He has evil intentions. Okay. On page 51, it's probably way towards the bottom. In his scheming on how to get rid of David, Saul proposed that David become his son-in-law by marrying his daughter Merab. This may have been Saul's way of fulfilling his promise to reward whoever killed Goliath. However, the Bible reveals that his main purpose was to get David in harm's way and let the Philistines kill him. David wisely declined Saul's offer, claiming that his poor background and humble birth were no match for Saul's eldest daughter. So Saul tried again. He offered his second daughter, Michal, who was in love with David. Encouraged by the lies of some of Saul's servants, David succumbed to the king's requests and killed 200 Philistines to earn the hand of Michal and become Saul's son-in-law. Under the protective hand of the Lord, David succeeded in all his battles with the Philistines. As a result, Saul became David's enemy continually. There's a lot we could dig into there, but we have 10 minutes, so I think that's a good enough review. He didn't marry Saul's oldest daughter. She was married off to someone else when he declined. He ends up marrying Michal, his second daughter. I don't know if there's another daughter. It might just be the youngest daughter. It may just be two. I'm not sure. But that works out, sort of. Chapter 19, verse 1. And Saul spoke to Jonathan his son and to all his servants that they should kill David. But Jonathan, Saul's son, delighted much in David, and Jonathan told David, saying, Saul my father seeks to kill thee. Now therefore, I pray thee, take heed to thyself until morning, and abide in a secret place and hide thyself. And I will go out and stand before my father in the field where thou art, and I will commune with my father of thee. I'll talk to him about you, and what I see, I will tell thee. I'll let you know. All right, on page 52 in your book, as a true friend, Jonathan told David of his father's plan and advised him to hide in a nearby field. Jonathan arranged for an open-air conversation with his father in the same area where David was hiding. At this meeting, Jonathan boldly defended his friend, citing all the good things David had done. He persuaded his father that David had not sinned against him. He urged Saul to drop all his plans to get rid of his dear friend. Seeing the logic of, Jonathan's arguments, Saul agreed. The wrong king's son. That's what's happening there. Encouraged by a report from Jonathan, David returned to Saul's court to soothe the moody king with his harp playing. I think that's a great way to put that. All right, I think we have enough information just to ask the question. What drew Saul back into a jealous, murderous mood? David was everything he wasn't. That's a good way to say that.
Jonathan's son, like a traitor. And so that was an added threat to David's threat. To the throne.
Yeah, so you have the evil spirit that is a continual problem for Saul. You have David getting the glory in battle, which, you send him to the front lines, and he just ends up being a war hero, and the people love him because they see him leading the troops in and out of the city against their enemies. And then Jonathan, his son, is more aligned to David than to Saul himself. So yeah, there's quite a bit going on here. All right, keep going. In chapter 19, look at verse 9. And the evil spirit from the Lord was upon Saul, and he sat in his house with his javelin in his hand, and David played with his hand. And Saul sought to smite David even to the wall with the javelin, but he slipped away out of Saul's presence, and he smote the javelin into the wall. David fled and escaped that night. Saul also sent messengers unto David's house to watch him, and to slay him in the morning. And Michal, David's wife, Saul's daughter, told him, saying, If thou save not thy life tonight, tomorrow thou shalt be slain. So Michal let David down through a window, and he went and fled and escaped. And Michal took an image and laid it in the bed, and put a pillow of goat's hair for his bolster, and covered it with a cloth. Michal did what I call a Ferris Bueller. Okay, so she's setting up, the classic, let's put the stuff in the bed that looks like your form and put it there, and when the messengers come the next day, she says, oh, no, he's sick, you shouldn't go in. They do anyway, and they find out David's not there. She let him out through this window the night before. So once again, you have, we just had Jonathan take David's side in this situation, and now you have Saul's daughter, who he married to David. She also helps David in favor of David, not King Saul. Actually, why don't we look at your book on page 53? Should be right at the top. Having discovered where David was hiding. Yeah, this is going to be a weird one. This is close to the end. Having discovered where David was hiding, Saul sent messengers to capture him. When they arrived in Naioth, they encountered Samuel leading a group of prophets. Then something totally unexpected happened. The Spirit of God came upon the messengers, and they too began to prophesy. Saul dispatched 2 more groups, but in each case the Holy Spirit overcame the messengers, and they began prophesying. So David escaped out the window, and he runs to a city. Saul finds out where he ran to, and he sends messengers there to find him, probably bring him back. And running into Samuel and his band of prophets, the Spirit of the Lord comes on these messengers, and they start, I don't know exactly what this looks like, because it's not normal, even for people who are considered prophets, to not be in control of it. It's not like an ecstatic thing, typically. But these messengers, they're kind of stuck. God is, whatever they're saying, they are expounding the glory of God in a way that they can't do their job anymore. It's a really bizarre situation. It's like if, all right, you sent 2 messengers out and they are just bursting into worship songs and they have no control over what's happening. So Saul gets irritated, he sends more messengers, the same thing happens, and finally Saul says, okay, enough. I'll just, let me do it myself. Need something done right? I'm going to go do it. Verse 23, and Saul went thither to Naioth in Ramah, and the Spirit of God came upon him also. And he went on and prophesied until he came to Naioth in Ramah. And he stripped off his clothes and prophesied before Samuel in like manner, and lay down naked all the day and all that night. Wherefore they say, is Saul also among the prophets? Now, we didn't cover it a whole lot in the coronation of Saul. Does anyone know this book well enough to know where this is Saul among the prophets comes from? We didn't cover it. Does anyone know this off the top of their head?
Is it his hometown?
No, so that phrase is significant. Okay, that's fine. So when they wanted a king, and Samuel first encounters Saul as a young man, he tells him everything, he tells him he's going to be king, and he sends him back to his father's house, but he says, hey, 4 things are going to happen along the way. These are going to be signs that what I'm saying to you is true. And one of the things that happens is Saul encounters this group of Samuel's prophets, and he himself starts prophesying in some somewhat uncontrollable way. And he says, you'll prophesy so much that other people it'll be a proverb in Israel. Like, is Saul among the prophets? Is he one of the prophets too? So when it happens at the beginning, it's a sign from Samuel, from God, that God has blessed him and chosen him to be king. So the original is Saul among the prophets. It's a sign of God's truth and blessing in his life. And now as it's happening, the same phrase, is Saul among the prophets? It's God intentionally hindering him from killing his new chosen man. So like the first time it's blessing, now it's a curse. So it's a very intentional bookmark. This phrase, a bookend, this phrase shows up. It's in chapter 10 if you're interested. I think it's 10:12. So Saul is kind of stuck. And we will end here. Still fearful, on page 53. Still fearful for his life, David fled to Jonathan. In a spirited exchange of words, David and Jonathan debated the issue of Saul's determination to kill David. From David's viewpoint, Saul's hatred was so obvious that David said, "There's but a step between me and death." No doubt he was referring to how close Saul came to pinning him against the wall with a spear. Now, Jonathan says, let me try one more time. They come up with this code. They say, okay, I'm going to talk to my dad, see what's going on. You hide in a field. There's this big rock. In a few days, I'm going to come out with a servant. I'm going to shoot my bow. Depending on what I tell the kid's going to fetch my arrows. If I say, oh, the arrows are before the rock, then come on out. Everything's safe. Everything's good. If I yell to the kid, oh, no, the arrows are gone way beyond the rock. Go look for them over there. Then it's a sign. My father is officially looking to kill you. I can't talk him out of it. You need to leave. So this is exactly what happens. Saul talks to his father, and it does not go well. They're in a feast situation, and Saul throws a javelin at Jonathan, just like he has been trying to kill David. There's a whole big situation. Jonathan leaves, distressed not only for his own situation, but for David's. Now he understands there's no hope in reconciling this here. So they do the code. He shoots arrows. They say, no, they're beyond the rock. You'd think, okay, so David's just going to get up and leave, but they're so close that it seems like Jonathan can't bear to just let it be, you heard the code word, see you around. He sends the kid back home, the servant, and on page 54 in your book, we'll set this up. The next day, it's another typo, the next day Jonathan put his plan into action and signaled David his father's reaction. He shot arrows skillfully and shouted to his assistant the words David needed to hear. After dismissing the assistant, Jonathan greeted David. The two men reminded each other of the covenant of love they had mutually accepted. Then they departed in sadness. David went to Nob, located about a mile north in Judah, and Jonathan went to Jerusalem. David was about to experience a long period of adversity as Saul grew more and more relentless. So their covenant we see in chapter 20, verse 42, and we'll end right on this. Jonathan said to David, "Go in peace, for as much as we have sworn, both of us, in the name of the Lord, saying, 'The Lord be between me and thee, and between my seed and thy seed forever.'" And he arose and departed, and Jonathan went into the city. So they had made this covenant that Jonathan knows he's not getting the kingdom. David's getting the kingdom. But they make this pact that they will do each other no harm, will do each other's children and lineage no harm. They're technically both viewed as people with rights to the throne. They make a pact of peace between themselves because they are such good friends. So they kind of reinstate this covenant between each other and go their separate ways. And if I remember correctly, I don't think they see each other again until, ever. They won't interact with each other again. So we're out of time. We covered a lot of material tonight. This easily could have been 2 weeks worth of material.
If David was so powerful, why didn't he go?
We will dig heavily into this next week. Yeah. Yeah, who doesn't want exercise? But yeah, so we were introduced to King David, to young David. He's anointed king. He defeats the giant. He does what Saul, the king, was supposed to be doing. He wins the love of everyone around him. He leads armies and is eventually driven out by Saul's increasing madness, his jealousy, his insecurity, his depression, the fact that the kingdom has been torn from him just drives Saul further and further down a dark, destructive road, and David is forced to flee for his life. And next week will be all about his journeys around and what happens and why. So any questions, any thoughts, anything need to be said?
So
Yeah.
they anointed David
Mm-hmm.
for king. So Saul's the king and David's the king. They're both kings.
Yeah, so Saul has...
I'm not taking it away from Saul. I thought he lost it.
Yeah, so it's sort of a situation where... So Samuel anointed David in a private little ceremony. Like, he's showing him God is choosing you to be king. As far as the nation is concerned, they don't know who David is. I mean, well, now they do, but as far as the nation's concerned, he's not king yet. So it's kind of like the old guard and the new kind of grinding up against each other in conflict. And it was the same way with Saul. If you remember from that lesson where we met Saul, he had a private thing where he told Saul he was going to be king. He anointed him privately as this is the Lord's anointing. And then they have a whole big public ceremony with the nation where he officially becomes king in the eyes of the people. So yeah, David is anointed by God and destined to be king, if we can put it that way. But as far as the nation's concerned, Saul is still the ruling king.
Will Saul have to die first in order for the change to take place? I mean, would that
Yeah.
have been standard then?
None of this is standard. No, this is not a normal situation. So, yeah, we'll be looking at all this in the coming weeks. But okay, good question. Let's close in order of prayer. Lord, we thank you for this study, for your word, for the things that we can learn and take from the good and the bad that we see in Scripture, the things we can understand from people following you by faith and people falling away from you in jealousy and pettiness and disobedience. So we thank you for what we can see from this and pray that you would use your word powerfully in our lives as we seek to serve you better. Pray you'd be with us and bring us back safely next week. In your name, Jesus, I pray. Amen. Thank you.